Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Many years ago, when I was still a nursing student, I witnessed something that has stayed with me for my entire career. After more than 20 years of working as a nurse, I have seen medical emergencies, unexpected recoveries, heartbreaking losses, and situations that seemed almost impossible to explain. But nothing has ever unsettled me quite like what happened during one particular code. Even now, I can still picture every detail. At the time, I was completing one of my clinical rotations in a busy hospital. Everything was new to me. Every shift felt like another lesson, and I spent most of my time trying to absorb as much as possible from the experienced nurses around me. I was nervous every day because I didn't want to make mistakes, but I was also fascinated by everything happening around me. One of the patients assigned to our floor was an elderly woman who had been admitted with several serious medical conditions. She wasn't particularly talkative anymore, but everyone who had cared for her over the previous weeks knew one thing about her. She had been very clear about how she wanted the end of her life to be handled. She did not want to be resuscitated. She had made her wishes known repeatedly while she was still mentally alert and able to make her own decisions. She had explained that she didn't want chest compressions, electrical shocks, or extraordinary efforts to prolong her life if her heart stopped. She wanted to pass peacefully. As healthcare workers, we respected that decision. Patients have the right to decide what medical treatments they do and do not want, and she had made her feelings absolutely clear. Unfortunately, her condition gradually worsened. As time passed, she became confused and eventually lost the ability to make her own medical decisions. Because she could no longer legally speak for herself, responsibility shifted to her family through medical power of attorney. Her children took over those decisions. Not long after that happened, they requested something that surprised many of the staff. They changed her code status. Instead of remaining a do not resuscitate patient, they instructed the hospital that she was now to be treated as a full code. If her heart stopped, every available effort was to be made to bring her back. Many of us felt uncomfortable about it. We all knew what the patient herself had wanted before losing the ability to communicate. She had never hidden those wishes. But legally, the situation had changed. The family now had authority to make medical decisions on her behalf, and the hospital was required to follow the current legal orders. Whether we agreed with those decisions or not didn't matter. Our responsibility was to follow the physician's orders and hospital policy. Even so, there was a sadness among the staff. Several nurses quietly talked about it during shift changes. No one argued with the family. No one refused care. But many of us couldn't help thinking about the conversations the patient had previously had with us. It felt as though her own wishes had somehow been lost. A few days later, everything changed. I was working on the unit when alarms suddenly began sounding. The patient's condition had rapidly deteriorated. Someone called for help. Within seconds, staff members hurried toward the room. Someone announced that she had no pulse. Another nurse confirmed she wasn't breathing. The cardiac monitor showed ventricular fibrillation. For anyone unfamiliar with the term, ventricular fibrillation is one of the most dangerous heart rhythms possible. Instead of pumping blood effectively, the heart quivers chaotically. Without immediate treatment, death can occur within minutes. A code blue was called. The peaceful atmosphere on the floor disappeared instantly. People came running from every direction. The code cart was pushed into the room. Respiratory therapy arrived. Additional nurses filled every available space around the bed. The physician entered moments later. Everything happened exactly the way emergency training teaches you. One nurse began chest compressions. Another prepared medications. Someone managed the airway. Others documented every intervention and every passing minute. As a student, I stayed where I was instructed and watched the experienced team work with incredible speed and coordination. Despite the urgency, everyone remained calm. No one panicked. Every person knew exactly what their role was. The physician looked at the cardiac monitor. The rhythm was still ventricular fibrillation. Charge the defibrillator. The machine began charging. The physician picked up the paddles. Clear. Everyone stepped back. He pressed the buttons to deliver the shock. Nothing happened. For a second, nobody understood what had gone wrong. He looked down at the machine. Maybe the charge hadn't completed properly. He reset it. The defibrillator charged again. Once more, everyone cleared away from the patient. He attempted another shock. Again, nothing. The machine simply refused to discharge. The room became noticeably quieter. Not because people stopped working. Chest compressions continued. Medications continued. But confusion spread through everyone standing there. Defibrillators are among the most carefully maintained pieces of equipment in a hospital. They are checked constantly. Every shift includes equipment checks. Batteries are tested. Functionality is verified. Readiness is documented. These machines are expected to work immediately during emergencies because lives depend on them. The physician examined the controls again. Everything appeared normal. He tried once more. The machine charged. The monitor indicated it was ready. He pressed the controls. Nothing. No shock. Someone suggested checking the connections. Another nurse quickly verified everything. Still nothing. The physician became visibly frustrated. He knew every second mattered. Again, they attempted to deliver the shock. Again, the machine failed. I remember looking around the room and seeing the confusion on everyone's faces. No one could explain it. The machine wasn't displaying an obvious error. It simply refused to do the one thing it had been built to do. CPR continued. Medications were administered according to protocol. The physician kept trying, but the defibrillator remained silent. Eventually, despite everyone's efforts, the patient's condition deteriorated beyond recovery. The cardiac rhythm changed. There was no meaningful electrical activity left. The room slowly became still. After every appropriate intervention had been attempted, the physician called the time of death. Just like that, the code was over. People lowered their shoulders. Gloves were removed. The organized urgency that had filled the room only moments earlier disappeared. It became quiet. There is always a strange silence after a code ends. The adrenaline fades. People begin processing what just happened. Some staff members started cleaning the room. Others documented the events. Someone reached toward the defibrillator. Whether it was curiosity or routine, I honestly don't remember. But they attempted to test it again. The machine worked immediately, perfectly, no hesitation, no malfunction. It charged. It discharged, exactly the way it was supposed to. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Several people stared at the machine. Someone tested it again. Once again, it functioned normally. There was no obvious explanation. The equipment hadn't been replaced, no battery had been changed, no repairs had been performed. Moments earlier, it had completely refused to deliver a life-saving shock. Now it behaved as though nothing had ever been wrong. The room filled with uneasy looks. Nobody really knew what to say. Some people immediately began discussing possible technical explanations. Perhaps there had been an internal electrical fault, maybe an intermittent hardware failure, maybe some component had temporarily malfunctioned. Hospitals investigate equipment issues very seriously, especially when they occur during emergencies. Others remained unusually quiet. A few nurses glanced toward the patient without saying anything. No one openly claimed anything supernatural had happened. We were medical professionals. We relied on science. We understood that equipment can fail, even if failures are extremely rare. Still, the timing was impossible to ignore. The patient had spent weeks making it clear she never wanted resuscitation. Her family had legally reversed that decision. Every member of the staff knew those original wishes. Then, during the very moment when the one intervention most likely to restore her heart rhythm should have occurred, the defibrillator simply refused to function. Only after she had passed away did it begin working normally again. Whether that was nothing more than an incredibly unlikely equipment malfunction or an extraordinary coincidence, I honestly cannot say. I don't pretend to know. Medicine doesn't always provide immediate answers. Machines can fail. Electronics can malfunction. Even with strict maintenance schedules, no piece of equipment is completely immune to unexpected problems. That is the rational explanation. It's also the explanation hospitals appropriately investigate first. But standing in that room as a nursing student, watching experienced physicians repeatedly attempt to deliver a shock while the machine remained completely unresponsive, it was difficult not to feel that something deeply unusual had happened. Afterward, the story quietly spread among the staff. People didn't exaggerate it. Nobody turned it into a ghost story. It was simply one of those cases everyone remembered because it was so unusual. During my career, I've worked in emergency departments, medical floors, intensive care units, and long-term care facilities. I've participated in countless codes. I've seen defibrillators used successfully more times than I could ever count. I've also seen situations where resuscitation unfortunately wasn't successful despite every effort. But I have never again witnessed a defibrillator refuse to deliver repeated shocks during an active code, only to function perfectly moments after the patient had died. Not once. More than 20 years have passed since that day. I've cared for thousands of patients. Most memories naturally fade with time. Faces blur together. Dates disappear. Specific conversations become difficult to remember. Yet that code remains crystal clear in my mind. I can still remember the sounds of chest compressions. The physician calmly repeating, "Clear." The silence after each failed attempt. The puzzled expressions on every face in the room. And finally, the strange moment when the machine suddenly worked as though absolutely nothing had happened. I don't know whether there was a technical explanation that no one ever discovered. Perhaps there was. I also don't know whether the timing was simply one of the most extraordinary coincidences I've ever witnessed. Perhaps it was. All I know is that one woman had spent the final part of her life asking for one simple thing. She wanted to be allowed to go peacefully. When the moment finally came, despite every legal order requiring us to attempt resuscitation, the one machine needed to carry out those wishes refused to cooperate until it no longer mattered. After more than 2 decades in nursing, I've never seen anything like it, before or since. And to this day, whenever I think about that code, I still can't say with certainty whether I witnessed an extraordinarily rare equipment failure or something that medicine simply cannot explain. When I was 16, I had an after-school job as a cleaner at my school. It wasn't the most exciting way to spend my afternoons, but it gave me a little extra money and looked good on job applications. Every day, once the final bell rang, I'd change into my work clothes and spend a couple of hours emptying bins, wiping desks, vacuuming classrooms, and cleaning hallways after everyone else had gone home. By the time I finished my shift, the school was almost completely empty. The noisy hallways that had been packed with students only a few hours earlier became strangely quiet. The teachers had already driven home, the buses were long gone, and most of the surrounding streets were nearly deserted. Occasionally I'd pass someone walking their dog or see a car drive by, but compared to the rush of students leaving school earlier in the afternoon, it felt like a completely different place. I followed the same route home every single day. It took about 25 minutes on foot. After doing it for months, I could have walked it with my eyes closed. There was never anything unusual about the journey, until one afternoon. I had just left the school grounds when I noticed a man walking behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People walked the same streets all the time. There was nothing strange about someone heading in the same direction. Still, something about him caught my attention. He wasn't particularly close to me, maybe 20 or 30 feet behind. But he stayed there. Every time I crossed the road, he crossed too. When I turned a corner, he turned the same corner. It could have been coincidence. I told myself I was imagining things. The man himself looked odd, even now, years later. It's difficult to describe exactly why he unsettled me so much. His face looked strangely smooth, almost artificial. It reminded me of plastic. Not shiny plastic like a toy, but tight and expressionless, as though his skin barely moved when he walked. The only expression he seemed capable of making was a faint smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't wide enough to seem cheerful. It was just there. A small curve at the corners of his mouth that never seemed to disappear. I remember looking back once or twice before finally reaching my street. He kept walking. I assumed he simply lived somewhere nearby. I forgot about it, or at least I tried to. About 2 weeks later, I saw him again. Same road, same distance behind me. Same strange smile. Again, I tried convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe our schedules happened to match. Maybe he worked nearby. Maybe he simply walked home at the same time. Then I saw him the next day, and the day after that. Soon it became impossible to ignore. Every single afternoon, after finishing work at school, I'd leave through the gates and eventually notice him somewhere behind me. Always walking, always following the exact route I took, always keeping roughly the same distance, never speaking, never trying to overtake me, just there, watching at 16. I should probably have told my parents. Looking back now, I absolutely should have. But teenagers don't always make sensible decisions. The last thing I wanted was my parents deciding I was no longer allowed to walk anywhere by myself. I knew exactly how that conversation would end. They'd insist on driving me to school, picking me up every afternoon, checking on me constantly. At 16, that sounded unbearable, so I kept quiet. Every afternoon, I'd tell myself I was overreacting. Every afternoon, I'd make it home safely. Eventually, I convinced myself nothing bad was going to happen, even though the feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. Weeks passed. The routine continued. I never spoke to him. He never spoke to me. He simply remained behind me every single day. Watching, then one weekend, everything changed. I was heading to my friend's house. Her neighborhood wasn't far from mine, and the quickest route happened to include part of the same main road I normally walked home from school. It was the middle of the day. There were more people around than there usually were after school, so I actually felt pretty relaxed. As I turned onto the familiar road, I happened to glance toward a small parking area near the corner. A white minibus was parked there. It looked ordinary enough. Then I noticed someone sitting behind the steering wheel. My stomach dropped. It was him. He wasn't looking at the road. He wasn't reading anything. He wasn't talking on a phone. He was staring directly at me through the windshield, completely still. That same unsettling smile sat on his face. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I looked away and kept walking. I remembered trying to convince myself that maybe I was mistaken. Maybe it only looked like him. Maybe I was letting weeks of anxiety get to me. But deep down, I already knew. It was the same man. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and immediately called my friend. She answered after only a couple of rings. I tried to sound casual at first. I didn't want to scare her. I just kept talking loudly enough that anyone nearby would know I wasn't alone. Part of me hoped the man would see I was on the phone and decide to leave. Instead, I made the mistake of glancing behind me. He was no longer sitting in the minibus. He was walking, and this time he was much closer, maybe 2 meters behind me. Close enough that I could clearly see his face without turning fully around. The smile hadn't changed. His expression was exactly the same as every other day. Calm, silent, watching me. Every instinct I had screamed that something was terribly wrong. I started walking faster. Within seconds, I realized he had matched my pace. I sped up again. So did he. The distance between us never changed. I could hear his footsteps behind mine. Step, step, step. Exactly matching my rhythm. I gripped my phone so tightly my hands started hurting. My friend immediately noticed the change in my voice. "What's wrong?" "He's behind me." "Who?" "The man I've told you about." She went quiet for a second. Then she asked where I was. I told her. She knew exactly which road I meant. "Just keep coming," she said quickly. I'll unlock the door. I didn't walk anymore. I started half jogging. Not a full sprint, just fast enough that I hoped I'd lose him. Instead, I heard his footsteps speed up too. He wasn't running. Neither was I. But he was matching everything I did. The distance never changed. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there, still smiling, still staring. I don't know how long that walk actually took. Probably only a few minutes. It felt like half an hour. Finally, I reached my friend's street. I could already see her standing outside her house with the front door open. The moment she spotted me, she started waving. I ran the last few meters. She grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. The second I crossed the doorway, she slammed the front door shut and locked it. Both of us stood there, breathing heavily. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she carefully peeked through the front window. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's still there." I looked. The man had stopped directly outside the house. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't trying to come inside. He was simply standing on the pavement, looking straight at the house. Smiling, it was one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. If he'd yelled threats or tried forcing the door open, it somehow would have made more sense. Instead, he just stood there, completely motionless, watching. Every now and then he'd shift his weight slightly. But the smile never disappeared. Neither did his eyes. He seemed completely focused on the front window. We stayed away from the glass as much as possible. Every so often, we'd risk another quick glance. He hadn't moved. My friend's parents weren't home yet. We talked about calling the police. Then we'd second-guess ourselves. What would we even say? That a man was standing outside? He hadn't technically done anything illegal. At least not yet. Still, neither of us felt safe. Eventually, her parents came home. I remember feeling an enormous sense of relief when their car pulled into the driveway. The strange thing was that the man didn't react. He didn't leave immediately. He didn't approach them either. He simply remained standing there. Watching, when my friend's dad noticed him, he frowned and looked toward the window where we were standing. By the time he reached the front door and stepped outside, the man had finally started walking away. He disappeared around the corner before anyone could stop him. We explained everything. Both her parents took it seriously. Mine did too when I finally admitted what had been happening for weeks. Looking back, I wish I'd told them sooner. Maybe the situation would never have reached that point. Maybe someone could have figured out who he was. After that weekend, though, something strange happened. I never saw him again, not once. The daily walks home became normal again. The roads were quiet. The school looked the same. Life slowly returned to normal. Eventually, I finished school. Time passed. I moved away. The whole experience became one of those memories that occasionally surfaced, but never completely disappeared. Every now and then, I'd think about that strange smile, or the sound of footsteps perfectly matching mine, or the way he stood outside my friend's house without saying a single word for hours. Then last weekend, I went back to visit my parents. The neighborhood hadn't changed very much. Most of the streets looked exactly as I remembered them. Out of curiosity, I drove along the old route I used to walk after school. Part of me wondered if I'd recognize anything. As I reached the same main road, something immediately caught my attention. The minibus. It was still parked in exactly the same place. Years had passed, yet there it was, faded from age, a little dirtier than I remembered, but unmistakably the same vehicle. I slowed down as I drove past. This time, it was empty. No one sat behind the wheel. No plastic-looking face stared back at me through the windshield. Still, seeing it sent a chill down my spine. Maybe it belonged to someone who lived nearby. Maybe it had nothing to do with the man at all. Or maybe it had been his all along. I'll probably never know. I've spent years wondering what he wanted. Maybe he was mentally ill. Maybe he simply enjoyed frightening people. Maybe I was one lucky decision away from something much worse. The truth is that I have no answers. What I do know is this. For weeks, a man followed the exact same route home behind a 16-year-old girl without ever speaking to her. Then, one weekend, he appeared waiting inside a parked minibus on a road he had no reason to be on. When she noticed him, he got out, followed her within arm's reach, matched her pace all the way to her friend's house, and then stood outside staring through the front window for nearly 2 hours without saying a word. Whatever his intentions were, I'll always be grateful that my friend answered the phone that day. Because every time I remember that expressionless, plastic-looking smile standing outside the window, I can't help wondering what might have happened if I'd been walking home alone instead. When I was around 13 years old, our family dog had a bad habit of escaping whenever someone forgot to latch the back gate properly. It happened often enough that it almost became routine. Someone would leave the gate slightly open after taking out the trash or carrying groceries inside, and before long, she'd notice the gap and wander out to explore the neighborhood. She wasn't the type of dog that ran away because she wanted to leave home. She was simply curious about everything. Every new smell, every squirrel, every overflowing garbage bin seemed like the most exciting thing in the world to her. Most of the time, she never wandered very far. I'd grab her leash, or sometimes not even bother, and head outside looking for her. Within 10 or 15 minutes, I'd usually find her sniffing around the alleys behind people's houses where everyone left their trash cans. The moment she spotted me, her ears would perk up, her tail would start wagging furiously, and she'd come running over as if she'd only been waiting for me to arrive. I'd scratch behind her ears, tell her she was a troublemaker, and we'd walk home together. It happened enough times that I almost stopped worrying whenever she disappeared. Almost, one afternoon, everything changed. Someone had left the gate open again. When I noticed she was gone, I sighed, grabbed my shoes, and headed outside expecting another quick search. I figured she'd be somewhere nearby investigating someone's garbage or chasing birds around an empty yard. I checked the alley behind our house first. Nothing. Then I walked around the next block. Still nothing. I called her name over and over. Usually I'd hear her bark within a minute or two. This time there was only silence. I kept walking. Every familiar place she normally visited was empty. I looked behind garages, around playgrounds, near the little patch of woods at the end of the street. Nothing. After 20 minutes, I started feeling nervous. After 40 minutes, that nervousness had turned into genuine fear. She had never stayed gone this long before. I kept telling myself she had probably wandered a little farther than usual, and I'd find her around the next corner. Then the next. Then the next. By the time nearly an hour had passed, I had walked farther than I ever remembered walking alone. I was roughly 6 blocks from home, in an area I barely recognized. Instead of detached houses like the neighborhood where we lived, this part of town had rows of rental properties and townhomes packed close together. I couldn't remember my dog ever coming this far, not even once. The sidewalks were quieter here. The streets felt unfamiliar. Even the atmosphere seemed different. I remember feeling completely alone. I was exhausted from walking and from constantly calling her name. My throat was dry, and I was beginning to accept that I might have to go home without her and hope she'd somehow find her own way back. That thought made my eyes sting with tears. She wasn't just a pet. She was part of our family. The idea of losing her terrified me. I slowed my pace and glanced one last time down a narrow lane between 2 rows of houses. That's when I noticed movement. It was small, barely noticeable. Something white shifted behind a tall wooden fence. Then I heard it. A tiny, desperate yip. My heart immediately started pounding. I hurried toward the fence and tried to look through the gaps between the boards. There, in the backyard of one of the townhouses, was my dog. She looked completely different than when she'd left home. Her white fur was muddy and soaked. She was chained to a metal post in the middle of the yard with a heavy chain around her collar. The moment she saw me, she exploded with excitement. She barked wildly. She pulled against the chain so hard that it snapped tight. Her tail wagged uncontrollably while she jumped toward the fence, desperate to reach me. I felt a wave of relief so powerful that I nearly started crying. I'd found her. At first, I assumed there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone had seen her wandering the streets and thought they were helping. Maybe they were waiting for someone to claim her. After all, she still had her collar on. She also had 2 tags attached. One was her city license. The other had our phone number and address engraved on it. Surely whoever found her would have noticed those. I figured I'd thank them for taking her in, and then we'd head home. Simple. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. No answer. I waited about 20 seconds. From inside, I could hear voices. People were definitely home. I rang the bell again. A few moments later, the front door opened just a few inches. An older man looked at me through the narrow opening. He barely opened the door wide enough for me to see his face. He looked annoyed more than anything else. Yes? He asked. Trying to be polite, I smiled. Hi, I said. I'm here about my dog. Thank you so much for finding her and getting her off the street. I expected him to smile back. Maybe apologize for not calling sooner. Instead, he stared at me without saying anything. Then he frowned. What dog? For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. My dog, I replied. The little white dog in your backyard. His expression didn't change. We have no dog. Then he started closing the door. I froze. My brain struggled to process what had just happened. Had I somehow gone to the wrong house? No, I had literally seen my dog through the fence. She was still barking. I could hear her. Before the door could close completely, I instinctively stuck my foot in the doorway. The dog in your backyard, I said, louder this time. I pointed toward the fence. Right there. Almost on cue, my dog started barking frantically again. The sound came directly from behind the house. The man slowly turned his head toward the backyard. Then he looked back at me. For a few seconds, he didn't say anything. His face twisted into an expression that looked somewhere between annoyance and disappointment, almost as if I'd interrupted something. Finally, he sighed. Oh, he paused, that dog. The way he said it sent chills down my spine. There was no surprise in his voice, no confusion. It sounded more like someone reluctantly admitting they had been caught. Without another word, he disappeared deeper into the house. The front door remained partly open. I stood there, completely confused. Every instinct told me something wasn't right. Nothing about the conversation had made sense. If he'd rescued her, why pretend she wasn't there? Why deny owning a dog that was barking loudly enough for both of us to hear? Why not simply say he'd found her wandering? I couldn't understand it. After waiting another minute, I started worrying he wasn't coming back at all. I walked around the side of the property again and looked over the fence. My dog was still straining against the chain. She looked desperate. She kept whining and pawing at the ground, trying to get closer. I made up my mind. If he wasn't going to give her back, I was climbing over that fence. I didn't care if I got in trouble. She was my dog. No one was keeping her. I grabbed the top of the wooden fence and started looking for a place to put my foot. Before I could climb over, the sliding patio door opened. The old man stepped outside. He walked slowly across the yard toward my dog. That's when I noticed something that made the entire situation even more unsettling. The second he approached her, she immediately lowered herself toward the ground. Her tail disappeared between her legs. She backed away from him as far as the chain would allow. She wasn't barking anymore. She looked terrified. I'd never seen her react to anyone that way before. She loved people. She greeted strangers like lifelong friends. Even delivery drivers got excited tail wags. But not this man. She acted as though she wanted to disappear. He reached down without saying a word and unclipped the chain from her collar. Then he walked over and opened the backyard gate. The instant the gate swung open, she bolted. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted straight across the yard toward me at full speed. I dropped to my knees just in time for her to practically throw herself into my arms. She was shaking. Her fur was damp. She smelled like mud and wet grass. She licked my face over and over while whining loudly. I wrapped both arms around her and held on tighter than I ever had before. When I looked back up, the old man was already walking toward his house. He never apologized. He never explained anything. He never asked if she belonged to me. He didn't even acknowledge us. He simply went back inside and closed the patio door behind him. That was it. No words. No explanation. Nothing. I hurried home with my dog walking so close beside me that she kept bumping into my leg every few steps. Normally, she'd stop every few feet to sniff bushes or investigate interesting smells. That day, she never wandered even an inch away from me. She stayed pressed against my side almost the entire walk home. When we finally reached our house, my family was relieved to see both of us. They asked where I'd found her. I explained everything. The strange conversation. The chained-up dog. The man pretending she wasn't there. Even then, none of us could come up with a logical explanation. If he had rescued her, why ignore the identification tags? Why deny she existed? Why chain her up without making any attempt to contact us? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Over the following days, I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my head. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe he didn't speak English well. Maybe another family member had brought her home without telling him. Maybe he'd simply been confused. I tried convincing myself of those possibilities, but something about his reaction never sat right with me. His expression when I pointed toward the backyard, the hesitation before admitting she was there, the complete lack of explanation, it all felt wrong. What bothered me most wasn't what happened. It was what might have happened if I hadn't walked those extra blocks. I had almost given up searching. I was exhausted. Another 5 minutes, and I probably would have turned around and gone home. If that had happened, would she still have been there the next day? Would anyone have called the phone number on her tag? Would she ever have come home? I'll never know. Fortunately, I found her before I made the decision to give up. Something changed in her after that day. Before then, she had always been adventurous. She loved wandering whenever she found an opportunity. After we brought her home, it was as though that experience had frightened her too. On the rare occasions when someone accidentally left the gate open again, she never disappeared into the neighborhood. Instead, we'd find her standing just outside the fence. Sometimes she'd only be 20 or 30 feet away. Once, she was sitting patiently right outside the backyard gate, almost as if she understood exactly where home was and had no interest in leaving anymore. She never wandered 6 blocks away again. As for me, that afternoon left me with questions I'll probably never have answers to. Maybe the man truly intended to return her eventually. Maybe he didn't. Maybe there was some misunderstanding that I was too young to recognize. Or maybe my instincts that day were right, and I interrupted something before it could become much worse. The truth is, I'll never know. What I do know is that when I looked through that fence and saw my dog chained to a post, barking desperately and pulling with everything she had just to reach me, something felt deeply wrong. And when the man looked me in the eyes and calmly insisted there was no dog in his yard, despite her barking loudly enough for both of us to hear, I experienced the kind of fear I'd never felt before. It wasn't the fear of getting lost. It wasn't the fear of confrontation. It was the chilling realization that sometimes another person's behavior can be far more frightening than anything you can imagine. Even now, years later, I still remember the look on his face when he reluctantly admitted, "Oh, that dog." I've never forgotten it, and I've never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd decided to go home just 5 minutes earlier. When I was a kid, my dad took me on a family hunting trip that ended up giving me a fear of spiders that has stayed with me for years. It wasn't because I got bitten by one or found one crawling across my bed. It came from one unforgettable afternoon in the woods that turned into the most terrifying experience of my childhood. To be honest, I never liked hunting in the first place. I wasn't one of those people who hated hunters or wanted to lecture everyone about animal rights. I simply didn't enjoy shooting animals. If people hunted because they genuinely needed food, I could understand that. But hunting just for trophies or bragging rights never made much sense to me. Even as a kid, it felt wasteful and cruel. My family loved it, though, so every once in a while I ended up tagging along whether I wanted to or not. On this particular trip, we drove deep into a large wooded area before sunrise. The air was cold enough that every breath came out in little white clouds. Everything around us was quiet, except for birds waking up in the distance and the occasional crack of branches beneath our boots. It should have been peaceful, but I was already wishing I had stayed home. The adults had a plan for where everyone would sit while waiting for deer to appear. Since I was too young to be trusted with a rifle and had absolutely no interest in hunting anyway, they gave me a different job. They drove me out to one of the ground blinds and told me to stay there until they came back. The blind was nothing more than a small camouflage shelter sitting in the middle of the woods. From the outside, it blended into the trees, and from the inside, it gave a decent view through several small windows. They handed me a radio and explained that if I saw any deer heading in another hunter's direction, I should let everyone know over the radio. That was my entire responsibility. Watch, wait, call if I saw something. Before they left, I asked how long I would be there. "Just be patient," my dad said. "We'll come get you later." Then they disappeared into the trees, and within a minute I couldn't hear them anymore. At first, I didn't mind being alone. I had packed my Game Boy along with a few games, so I figured I could keep myself entertained while the adults played hunter. I spent the first hour playing Pokemon. Time passed painfully, slowly. Every now and then, I would glance out the little windows, hoping to see a deer, just so something interesting would happen. Nothing did. The forest barely moved. A squirrel climbed one tree. A bird landed on a branch. Leaves shifted whenever a breeze came through. That was it. Eventually, I became tired of battling the same wild Pokemon over and over again. My batteries weren't going to last forever anyway, so I turned off the Game Boy and started digging through my backpack, hoping I had packed another game, or maybe a comic book. As I searched through the bag, I suddenly heard an odd sound. Whoosh! It wasn't loud. It wasn't like wind blowing through the trees. It sounded close. Very close. I froze and listened. Silence, I looked around the tiny blind. Nothing. I shrugged it off and went back to searching. Then I heard it again. Whoosh! This time it sounded like it came from just outside the shelter. I frowned. Maybe an animal had brushed against the side. Maybe a bird had landed nearby. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside and slowly walked around the blind, looking for whatever had made the sound. The front looked normal. The left side looked normal. Then I walked around to the back. I wish I hadn't. The entire rear wall of the hunting blind was covered from top to bottom with daddy longlegs. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. Every inch of the wall seemed alive. Their long legs were woven together into one giant moving blanket of spiders. They climbed over each other in every direction, constantly shifting as though the entire wall itself was breathing. I had never seen anything like it. The mass moved in slow waves, and every tiny movement made another faint rushing sound. That was the whooshing noise I had heard, thousands of tiny legs rubbing together. Even now, years later, I can still remember the sight perfectly. People always tell you daddy longlegs are harmless. Maybe they are. That didn't matter. When you're staring at what looks like a living wall made entirely of spiders, logic disappears. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I took one step backward, then another. Then I stopped. I had absolutely no idea where our camp was. I hadn't walked there. My dad had driven me out on an ATV, winding through trails that all looked exactly the same. If I ran into the woods, there was a good chance I'd only get lost. The radio worked, but I knew everyone had spread out over a large area. It could take a long time before someone reached me. So instead of making the smart decision and simply staying away from the back of the blind, my child brain came up with a much worse idea. Inside my backpack, I had a can of bug spray. I also had a lighter. Somewhere in my head, I remembered seeing people use aerosol cans like flamethrowers in movies. It looked easy. It looked effective. I convinced myself I could burn the spiders off the wall from a safe distance. Looking back now, I realize how unbelievably stupid that was. At the time, it sounded brilliant. I grabbed the can, pulled out the lighter, walked toward the back of the blind, held the lighter in front of the spray. Then, pressed the nozzle. A bright stream of fire burst outward with a loud roar. For one glorious second, I thought my plan had worked. The flames rolled across the wall. The spiders instantly reacted, but not the way I expected. I had forgotten one very important detail. I was standing downwind. The moment the fire touched them, thousands of spiders released their grip at exactly the same time. The wind caught them. Instead of falling harmlessly to the ground, they flew straight at me. Imagine someone throwing a burning blanket into your face. Now imagine that blanket is made entirely of spiders. That was what I saw. The whole wall lifted into the air. Some were burning, some weren't, but all of them were flying directly toward me. I didn't think. I didn't even breathe. I screamed louder than I ever had before. The first spiders hit my face. More landed in my hair. Others bounced off my chest and shoulders. Some got tangled in my clothes. I completely lost my mind. I ran without knowing where I was going. I tripped over roots, fell to the ground, started rolling through dirt and leaves while screaming at the top of my lungs. I could feel tiny legs crawling everywhere. Whether they actually were or whether panic made me imagine it, I still don't know. It felt like they covered every inch of my body. I ripped off my jacket, then my shirt, then everything else. I didn't care that I was standing half naked in the middle of the woods. The only thing that mattered was getting every single spider away from me. I kept slapping at my arms, brushing through my hair, checking inside my sleeves, shaking out my boots. Every time I thought they were gone, I imagined another one crawling across my skin. Eventually, I stumbled back toward the blind, where the radio was still sitting inside. I grabbed it with shaking hands. Dad. No answer. I tried again. Dad. Please answer. A burst of static came through. Then his voice. What happened? I could barely speak because I was crying so hard. There are spiders everywhere. He sounded confused. What? Come get me. What happened? I don't care. Come get me. We're leaving. I don't even remember exactly what I said after that. I know I was crying. I know I was yelling. I know I was swearing more than I ever had in my entire life. For a kid who almost never cursed, it shocked even me. Every sentence came out between sobs. My dad must have realized something was seriously wrong because he stopped asking questions and simply said he was on his way. Those next few minutes felt endless. I stood there shaking, constantly brushing imaginary spiders off my body. Every tiny movement in the grass made me jump. Every falling leaf looked like another spider drifting toward me. Even after checking myself over and over, I couldn't convince my brain that they were gone. When I finally heard the ATV approaching through the trees, I nearly burst into tears all over again. My dad pulled into the clearing and immediately looked concerned. He climbed off and asked what had happened. At first, I couldn't explain it properly. I just pointed toward the back of the blind. By then, most of the spiders had scattered. The huge living wall was gone. Only clusters remained where they had started gathering again. He looked at the burn marks on the shelter, then looked at the lighter, then looked at the bug spray. He didn't even have to ask. He knew exactly what I had tried to do. Part of him probably wanted to laugh. To his credit, he didn't. He could see I was genuinely terrified. Instead, he helped me calm down, made sure I wasn't burned or bitten, and loaded my things onto the ATV. The hunting trip ended, for me, right there. I wasn't staying another minute. On the ride back to camp, I barely spoke. I kept checking my sleeves, looking over my shoulders, feeling like something was still crawling across my neck. Even after we got home, the fear didn't disappear. For weeks afterward, I couldn't walk into a garage, shed, or basement without checking every corner. If I saw even one spider, my heart started racing. I constantly imagined more hiding nearby. At night, I sometimes woke up convinced spiders were crawling across my blankets. There never were. But it always felt real. My parents eventually realized this wasn't just a childhood overreaction. The fear had become genuine. It had followed me into everyday life. After a while, they arranged for me to talk with someone about it. Therapy helped more than I expected. It didn't erase the memory, but it slowly taught me how to separate what had happened from every spider I would ever see again. Over time, I stopped panicking every time I spotted one across the room. I learned to stay calm. I learned that not every spider meant another nightmare was about to happen. Still, the memory never completely disappeared. Even today, years later, I don't like being around spiders. I don't care how harmless people say they are. If I walk into a room and notice one sitting in the corner, I'm already thinking about the quickest way to leave. If someone tells me it's just the daddy longlegs, I smile politely and keep my distance anyway. Because whenever I hear those words, my mind immediately goes back to that lonely hunting blind in the middle of the woods. I remember the strange whooshing sound. I remember walking around the corner. I remember seeing an entire wall that seemed to breathe. Most of all, I remember making one incredibly stupid decision that turned thousands of harmless spiders into what looked like a flying nightmare. People sometimes ask why I'm so uncomfortable around spiders. I usually laugh and tell them it's a long story. The truth is, there are memories that stay with you long after the danger is gone. Some people remember car crashes. Some remember near drownings. I remember standing in the woods as an entire wall of flaming spiders lifted into the air and came straight at my face. No matter how much time passes, that's one image I don't think I'll ever completely forget. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. My friend and I were driving home from high school one afternoon when something happened that still makes me nervous whenever I think about road rage. It started as an ordinary drive. School had just let out, traffic was fairly heavy, and we were making our way through a major intersection on the way home. We pulled up to a red light. Nothing unusual. When the left turn arrow finally turned green, my friend accelerated into the intersection. He was a teenager, excited to finally have his license, and he probably hit the gas a little harder than necessary. The tires chirped against the pavement for a second before gripping. It wasn't some dramatic burnout, just enough to make a little noise. Apparently that was enough to set someone off. A green pickup truck that had been behind us suddenly sped up into the lane beside us. The driver pulled right alongside our car. I looked over and immediately felt my stomach tighten. The man behind the wheel was bald, heavily built, and looked absolutely furious. His face was bright red. He was screaming at us through his closed window. I couldn't hear a single word he was saying, but I didn't need to. His expression said enough. Neither of us reacted. We just kept driving. I remember hoping he'd lose interest after a few seconds. Instead, he stayed beside us. Unfortunately, the next traffic light turned red. We had no choice but to stop. As we rolled to a halt, the pickup pulled up directly next to us again. This time, he positioned his truck so close that our windows were almost side by side. He immediately started waving for us to roll our window down. Neither of us wanted anything to do with him. My friend shook his head politely. I remember trying to avoid eye contact. We hoped he'd simply drive away when the light changed. Instead, his behavior became even more disturbing. He lifted his hand. He pointed 2 fingers at us like a gun. Then, he slowly moved the imaginary gun toward his own head. He mimed pulling the trigger. At first, I didn't understand what he was trying to say. Then, he repeated the gesture toward us. My heart started pounding. It wasn't just an angry driver yelling anymore. It felt like a threat. Then, I watched him lean toward his glove compartment. Maybe he was grabbing paperwork. Maybe he was reaching for something completely harmless. But after making that gesture, neither of us was willing to assume the best. At that exact moment, the traffic light turned green. Neither of us said a word. We just looked at each other. My friend slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The tires spun briefly before the car shot forward. Behind us, the pickup did exactly the same thing. He wasn't letting us go. Within seconds, he was right behind us. So close that all I could see in the mirror was the front of his truck. Every time my friend sped up, he matched our speed. Every turn we made, he made. It became obvious very quickly that this wasn't coincidence. He was following us. Panic started setting in. Neither of us had any idea what to do. Driving home suddenly seemed like a terrible idea. We didn't want this man knowing where either of us lived. Then I remembered something. My neighborhood had a confusing layout with several side streets and cul-de-sacs. I'd grown up there. I knew every shortcut. If we could get just enough distance between us, maybe we could disappear before he saw where we went. I quickly explained the plan. Stay ahead of him. Turn suddenly. Hide. As we entered my neighborhood, my friend accelerated again. We reached the first opportunity and made a sharp left into a subdivision. The truck followed. We kept going. At the last possible second, we turned onto a smaller residential street. Then another. Finally, we ducked into a busy cul-de-sac lined with parked cars. My friend pulled into a driveway behind another vehicle where we couldn't easily be seen from the street. We shut the engine off. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, listening. Every second felt much longer than it probably was. Finally, we heard an engine. The green pickup rolled slowly past the entrance to the street. He drove by without turning in. Apparently, he hadn't seen us. We waited until the sound disappeared completely before either of us took a breath. The relief was overwhelming. Only then did we start laughing. Not because anything was funny. Because adrenaline has a strange way of releasing itself once the danger feels like it's over. The laughter quickly faded. The reality of what had just happened settled in. We still had no idea who that man was. We had no idea what he wanted. Maybe he'd only intended to scare us. Maybe the hand gesture meant nothing. Or maybe we'd narrowly avoided something much worse. Neither of us wanted to find out. Instead of driving home immediately, we called the police. An officer met us nearby, took our report, and stayed with us long enough to make sure it was safe for us to head home. We never saw the truck again. Looking back now, I realize we were incredibly lucky. Road rage can escalate frighteningly fast. Whether that man actually had a weapon or not, we had no way of knowing in the moment. What mattered was treating the threat seriously. If I could change anything, I probably wouldn't have driven toward my neighborhood at all. Today, I'd head directly to the nearest police station or somewhere crowded while calling emergency services. At 17, though, panic doesn't leave much room for perfect decisions. You rely on whatever feels familiar. Fortunately, in our case, it worked. I've forgotten plenty of ordinary drives home from school. I'll never forget that one, because sometimes the scariest encounters don't happen in abandoned buildings or lonely forests. Sometimes they happen in broad daylight, at a busy intersection, surrounded by dozens of other drivers who have absolutely no idea what's unfolding in the car beside them. When I was 18, my grandfather had been struggling with serious heart problems for quite some time. Not long before that, my grandmother had passed away. They had been married for decades, and losing her completely changed him. The house, that had once felt warm and full of conversation, suddenly became painfully quiet. He lived alone, and the loneliness seemed almost as difficult for him as the heart condition itself. Every morning, before doing anything else, I would drive over to his house. It became part of my daily routine. I'd help him with little things around the house that had become difficult because of his health. Sometimes I'd make him something to eat. Sometimes we'd just sit together in the living room watching television without saying much. Other days we'd spend hours talking about family stories, his younger years, or memories of my grandmother. He appreciated the company more than anything. I think in a way those visits helped both of us. Watching someone you love slowly become weaker is difficult, but spending that time with him is something I'll always be grateful for. Then came a morning I'll never forget. It was June 7th. I remember the date as clearly as if it happened yesterday. When I walked through the front door, something immediately felt different. Normally, my grandfather looked tired. His illness had taken a lot out of him, but that morning he looked happy. Not just slightly happier than usual. He had the biggest smile I'd seen since before my grandmother died. His whole face looked different. There was a calmness about him that I hadn't seen in months. Seeing him like that instantly lifted my mood. I smiled right back. It felt like maybe he was finally having a good day. As soon as I sat down beside him, he looked directly at me with that same peaceful smile. Then he asked, "Guess what?" I laughed and asked what. Without any hesitation, he said, "I'm going to go see my wife in 2 days." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I honestly thought he was confused. His heart problems had been getting worse, and I wondered if maybe he was simply talking about visiting her grave. Or perhaps he was dreaming. Or maybe his medication was affecting him. I didn't want to upset him, so I smiled and gently changed the subject. But the sentence stayed in my mind. There was something unusual about the way he said it. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't sad. He wasn't afraid. He sounded completely certain, almost excited. The next 2 days felt surprisingly peaceful. His condition didn't suddenly improve, but his mood never changed. He smiled constantly. He seemed completely at ease. There was no fear in him, no anxiety, no anger about being sick. It was as though a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Looking back now, that's the part I remember most. Not what he said, how peaceful he became afterward. Then, exactly 2 days later, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. There was no dramatic final moment, no panic, no suffering that we knew of. He simply went to sleep and never woke up. Afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd told me. I'm going to go see my wife in 2 days. The timing was impossible to ignore. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe, deep down, he sensed his body was shutting down in ways none of us could recognize. There are stories from hospice workers and families describing people who seem to know when they're nearing the end of life. Some begin talking about loved ones who've already passed away. Some say they're preparing for a journey. Others suddenly become calm after weeks or months of fear and discomfort. Whether that's psychological, physiological, spiritual, or something we simply don't yet understand, I honestly don't know. I only know what I witnessed. A man who had been lonely and grieving for months suddenly woke up smiling. He confidently announced he would see his wife in exactly 2 days. Then, 2 days later, he died peacefully in his sleep. Even after all these years, I still think about that conversation. Not because it frightened me, because it left me with questions I'll probably never be able to answer. Whatever happened that morning, my grandfather didn't seem scared. If anything, he seemed happier than he'd been since losing my grandmother. Sometimes that's the memory I choose to hold on to. Not the sadness of losing him, but the image of him sitting there with that enormous smile, looking more at peace than I'd seen him in a very long time, as though he already knew something the rest of us didn't. A few years ago, just before Christmas, I had one of the strangest weeks of my life. Nothing supernatural actually happened. At least, I don't think it did. But by the end of that week, after narrowly avoiding what felt like death 3 separate times, my mind was so on edge that even my dreams seemed determined to finish the job. It all started after my final exams. A friend and I had just finished our last test before the holidays and were driving home, relieved that the semester was finally over. Traffic was fairly heavy. Ahead of us was a large intersection with a red light. I slowed down and came to a complete stop in the right-hand lane of a 4-lane road facing south. There were about 6 cars stopped in front of me. A side street joined the intersection on my right. Everything seemed completely normal. Then I heard it, the sound of tires screeching. A split second later came the impact. Another driver slammed into the rear right corner of my car. It wasn't a devastating crash, but it was hard enough to jolt both of us forward. My friend and I got out to check the damage. The other driver climbed out as well. Everyone was shaken, but thankfully no one appeared to be injured. We exchanged insurance information and started taking pictures of the vehicles for documentation. I wanted one wide-angle photo showing both cars, the position they had come to rest in, and the nearby street signs. Before stepping into the roadway, I looked north to make sure no cars were coming. The road looked clear enough. I walked into the left southbound lane and snapped the picture. As I lowered my phone, my friend called my name. He wanted me to unlock the trunk so he could grab some paper and write down his witness statement while everything was still fresh. I walked back toward my car. The moment I stepped out of the lane, I heard another engine. A driver traveling north had apparently been so distracted by our accident that he drifted completely across the center line and into the lane I'd been standing in only a second earlier. He flew past at around 70 kilometers an hour. If I'd stayed where I was for another second, he almost certainly would have hit me. He missed me by what felt like less than a foot. I remember standing there, staring after the car, realizing how unbelievably close that had been. It rattled me, but after a day or two, I convinced myself it had simply been terrible luck. Then it happened again. 2 days later, a group of us went paintballing. One of them was the same friend who had been with me during the car accident. Between matches, everyone gathered in the lobby. Masks came off, markers were put on safe, and barrel covers stayed on while people rested or bought more paintballs. I was leaning against the wall, talking with everyone. My friend walked over and asked if he could borrow some money to buy another box of paint. I reached into my pocket. Since he was standing slightly to my right, I leaned sideways to hand him my wallet. The instant I moved my head away from the wall, something exploded behind me. Splat, the sound was loud enough that everyone nearby turned. I looked behind me. A paintball had burst against the exact spot where my head had been only a second before. For a moment, nobody understood what had happened. Then, someone across the room realized it had been their marker. Apparently, they had been setting it down on a table when everything went wrong at once. The barrel cover's retaining strap snapped. The cover fell off. The safety somehow disengaged. The marker fired. It was nothing more than an accident. But at roughly 250 feet per second, a paintball striking someone directly in the eye can cause devastating injuries. If I hadn't leaned to the side at that exact moment, I could have lost an eye. Again, I walked away completely unharmed. Again, I couldn't stop thinking about how close it had been. By then, I was starting to joke that someone upstairs clearly wanted to keep me alive, or that someone else was trying very hard to do the opposite. 2 days after that, our group went out drinking. It was another ordinary night, nothing unusual. We were walking along a busy downtown street toward our next stop. I've always been a fast walker. Without realizing it, I kept pulling ahead of everyone else. Every 20 or 30 meters, I'd stop, turn around, and wait for the group to catch up. Eventually, I got tired of stopping. We were almost at our destination anyway. This time, I decided I'd just keep walking and meet everyone inside. I took a few more steps. Then, for reasons I still can't explain, I stopped again. I turned around and shouted back that I'd meet them inside. As I was speaking, I heard an engine screaming somewhere behind me. I turned toward the sound. A Porsche came flying down the street far faster than it should have been. Before I could even process what I was seeing, it slammed directly into the wall of a building at almost a perfect right angle. The impact was unbelievable. The front half of the car crumpled. Airbags exploded. Glass sprayed across the street. The sound echoed between the buildings. I just stood there, frozen. If I hadn't stopped to yell back to my friends, I would have been several meters farther ahead, right where the car struck the wall. 3 separate incidents, 3 times in less than a week. Each one ending with me walking away because of a decision that seemed completely random. By then, I was mentally exhausted. Every time I left the house, I found myself expecting something else to happen. Then came Boxing Day. That night, I barely slept, partly because I was excited about plans I had the next morning with the same friend from the first 2 incidents, partly because my mind simply wouldn't settle down. Sometime during the early hours, I had one of the most vivid nightmares I've ever experienced. Even now, I remember pieces of it with uncomfortable clarity. The first thing I remember is jumping out of the back of a panel van. There was a rope tied around my hand. For some reason, I knew someone was trying to kill me. Not suspected. Knew I landed in my own driveway. I ran toward the front door as fast as I could. In the dream, I somehow tied the rope to the doorknob because whoever was chasing me was attached to the other end. I slammed the door shut, locked every lock, started barricading windows. Anything I could think of. I called 911. The dispatcher calmly told me every officer was busy. No one could come. I remember the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. I hung up and reached for the phone again. That's when I noticed the rope. It had gone slack. Someone had cut it. The realization hit me instantly. Whoever had been outside was now free. I tried to stay perfectly quiet. Then every noise in the house started at once. The kettle whistled. The bathroom fan roared. Water started running. The television turned on. A radio blared somewhere. The entire house erupted into noise. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, measured, coming from upstairs. I looked toward the staircase. A single foot appeared on the top step. Then, another. Whoever it was started walking down toward me. At that exact moment, I woke up screaming. I was drenched in sweat, completely disoriented. Before I even realized I'd been dreaming, the first words out of my mouth were, Slender Man. I hadn't consciously been thinking about the character at all that week, yet somehow my exhausted brain had turned every close call into one final nightmare. Looking back now, I don't believe there was anything supernatural happening. After 3 genuine near misses in such a short period of time, it's not surprising that my mind became hyper alert and eventually spilled that anxiety into my dreams. Still, I've never experienced another week quite like it. 3 times I unknowingly stepped out of danger at exactly the right second. Then my subconscious spent the night convincing me my luck had finally run out. Whether it was coincidence, incredible fortune, or simply being in the right place at the right time, it's a week I'll never forget. Because sometimes surviving isn't what haunts you. It's realizing afterward just how close you came to not surviving at all. About 4 years ago, something happened that I still can't explain. It only lasted for a little over an hour, but it completely shattered my confidence in something I had always taken for granted. Time, not the feeling of time passing, the actual clocks. Even now, years later, I remember one specific time more clearly than almost anything else from that morning. 10:21. That's the number that started everything. It was my day off, so I slept in later than usual. When I finally opened my eyes, the first thing I did was glance at the alarm clock beside my bed. It read 10:21. I remember it because I briefly thought, well, there goes half the morning. I got out of bed, stretched, and wandered into the bathroom. Like most people on a lazy day off, I wasn't in any hurry. I used the restroom, brushed my teeth, stood under the warm water at the sink for a while, half awake and doing absolutely nothing productive. Eventually, I got dressed, walked back into my bedroom, and picked up my phone to check for messages. The screen lit up. 10:25. I frowned. That didn't seem right. There was no way everything I'd just done had taken only 4 minutes. I'd spent longer than that just standing in the bathroom. For a moment, I questioned myself. Maybe I'd read the clock wrong when I woke up. Maybe it hadn't said 10:21. Maybe it had been 10:24 and I'd simply been too sleepy to notice. I looked over at the alarm clock beside my bed. It also said 10:25. Well, that seemed to settle it. I figured I'd simply misread the first time and didn't think much more about it. I headed downstairs, I turned on my computer, switched on the television so I could listen to the morning news while making breakfast. Grabbed a glass of water, started frying some eggs. Then I remembered there was leftover rice in the refrigerator from the night before. I opened the microwave. As I reached to place the bowl inside, my eyes landed on the microwave clock. 10:25. I stopped. That couldn't be right. I immediately pulled my phone out of my pocket. 10:25. I stood there trying to process it. I knew exactly what I'd done since checking the time upstairs. I'd walked down the stairs, filled a glass with water, turned on the television, started the computer. taken food out of the refrigerator, started cooking eggs. Even if I'd rushed, all of that should have taken several minutes. Yet somehow, every clock insisted it was still 10:25. I decided there had to be something wrong with the microwave clock. Maybe it had frozen. To test it, I stood directly in front of it and began counting. 1, 2, 3. I planned to count to 60. If it still hadn't changed to 10:26 after a full minute, I'd know it was broken. I barely reached 20 before the display changed. 10:26. That actually made perfect sense. It must have already been around 40 seconds into the minute when I started counting. The microwave seemed to be keeping time normally. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it somehow made everything stranger. I finished cooking breakfast, carried my plate into the computer room, and sat down. The monitor had finished booting. Without thinking, I glanced at the clock in the corner of the screen. 10:20. I stared. No, that wasn't possible. I grabbed my phone again. It also said 10:20, not 10:26, not even 10:25. Time had somehow gone backwards. 6 minutes backwards. That was the exact moment I realized something genuinely bizarre was happening. I grabbed a notebook and started writing everything down. If all the clocks were malfunctioning, somehow, I wanted a record before I started doubting my own memory. Then I opened the clock application on my computer and watched the second hand move. Everything looked perfectly normal. Second after second passed exactly as it should. 10:20 became 10:21. Then 10:22. Nothing unusual happened while I watched. The second hand swept smoothly around. When I was younger, my family lived with my grandparents for a while. Their house was full of old furniture, family heirlooms, and decorations that had been around for decades. Most of it didn't bother me. One thing definitely did. My aunt had a Victorian-style doll in her bedroom. It wasn't a normal doll. It stood about 2 feet tall. Someone had converted it into a lamp. Even describing it now makes me uncomfortable. The doll stood on a nightstand beside my aunt's bed. It always faced the bedroom door, so anyone who walked into the room was immediately greeted by its lifeless eyes and frozen smile. Its face had that old-fashioned porcelain look that somehow managed to seem cheerful and unsettling at exactly the same time. But the creepiest part wasn't how it looked. It was how you turned the lamp on. There wasn't a switch on the cord. There wasn't a button on the base. To turn it on, you had to hold the doll's cold plastic hand, lift its arm upward, and then lower it again. Some mechanism inside the body would click, and the light would come on. Every single time I saw someone do it, it felt like watching them wake the doll up. I hated it. As a kid, I avoided that room whenever I could. If I absolutely had to go inside, I got in and out as quickly as possible. One afternoon, I was home alone. I wanted to grab a blanket from my aunt's closet. Unfortunately, the blanket I wanted happened to be in that room. I stood outside the bedroom for a few seconds, trying to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. It was daytime. Bright sunlight filled the house. Nothing scary was going to happen. I reminded myself of 2 things that made the situation slightly better. First, it was the middle of the afternoon. I didn't need the lamp. Second, the closet sat immediately beside the bedroom door. I wouldn't have to walk all the way into the room. I could step inside, grab the blanket, and leave in seconds. That was the plan. The only problem was the doll. I didn't even want to look at it. So I came up with what seemed like a brilliant strategy. I'd keep my eyes on the floor the entire time. If I never looked at the doll, I couldn't get creeped out by it. Simple. I opened the bedroom door. Keeping my eyes lowered, I stepped inside. I immediately turned toward the closet. That movement left my back facing the doll. Perfect. As far as I was concerned, it could stay behind me where I didn't have to see it. I reached for the closet door, opened it, bent down, started searching for the blanket. Everything was fine. Then, something changed. I noticed it before I consciously understood what had happened. The room suddenly felt brighter. Not by much, just enough that it caught my attention. I stopped moving. For a second, I couldn't figure out why the lighting had changed. Then I realized. The lamp was on. Every tiny hair on the back of my neck seemed to stand up at once. I froze exactly where I was. My heart started pounding. I knew I hadn't touched the doll. I hadn't even looked in its direction. The room was completely silent. Every instinct told me to run. But another part of me desperately needed to know. Was the lamp really on? Had I somehow imagined it? I slowly started turning toward the door. For a brief second, I considered keeping my eyes on the floor all the way out. Then, curiosity got the better of me. I looked. The lamp was glowing. The doll's arm was raised. Its plastic hand pointed directly toward me. I don't know why that detail unsettled me more than anything else. Maybe because I'd always associated the raised arm with someone physically standing beside the doll and lifting it. Seeing it frozen in that position while I was alone in the room made my stomach drop. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't check the switch. I didn't try to figure out whether the mechanism had slipped. I left the room as fast as I could. Even now, years later, that image is still incredibly vivid. The glowing lamp, the raised arm, a hand pointing straight toward me. As an adult, I can think of several ordinary explanations. Old mechanical lamps can malfunction. Gravity, worn springs, or a loose switching mechanism could have caused the arm to move or the light to turn on unexpectedly. Someone else may have left the mechanism partially engaged earlier without realizing it. Those possibilities are much more likely than anything supernatural. But when you're 13 years old, standing alone in an otherwise quiet house, logic doesn't always arrive before fear does. Fear fills in the blanks much faster. That's probably why the memory has stayed with me for so many years. It wasn't necessarily because anything paranormal happened. It was because every single detail lined up perfectly to create one unforgettable moment. An empty house. A room I'd always avoided. A doll I already found unsettling. A lamp that somehow turned itself on while my back was turned. And when I finally worked up the courage to look, its arm was already raised, as if it had been waiting for me the entire time. Whether there was a perfectly ordinary mechanical explanation or not, I never looked at that doll the same way again. Some childhood fears disappear as you grow older. That one never completely did. One of the strangest things that has ever happened to me took place when I was 13 years old. Nothing dramatic happened. No one chased me. I never actually saw anyone. There weren't any loud crashes or obvious signs of danger. In fact, that's probably what makes the memory so unsettling even now. For years, I tried to come up with a normal explanation for it. Maybe I misunderstood what I heard. Maybe the house made unusual noises. Maybe I imagined part of it. But no explanation has ever completely fit. And even now, I still remember that afternoon as clearly as if it happened yesterday. At the time, my daily routine was almost identical every weekday. My mom would pick me up from school in the afternoon, drive me home, and then immediately leave again to pick up my younger brother from his school. His school finished a little later than mine, so I was usually home alone for 15 or 20 minutes before they returned. I loved those quiet afternoons. I'd throw my backpack onto the floor, grab a snack if I was hungry, and head straight for the family computer. This was before everyone had smartphones or laptops, so the desktop computer in our house was where I spent most of my free time. I'd check messages, play games, browse the internet, or waste time doing whatever interested a 13-year-old after school. It was such a familiar routine that I barely had to think about it anymore. One afternoon started exactly the same way. My mom pulled into the driveway. I got out of the car, thanked her, and walked inside while she backed out to go pick up my brother. I remember hearing the garage door close behind me. I tossed my backpack near the front door, kicked off my shoes, walked into the computer room, turned on the computer. Everything felt completely normal. Within a few minutes, I was focused on whatever game or website had my attention that day. The house was quiet. Quiet enough that every little sound echoed through it. After sitting there for several minutes, I suddenly heard something coming from the kitchen. The faucet turned on. It ran for a few seconds. Then it shut off. I barely looked up from the computer screen. I simply assumed my mom hadn't actually left yet. Maybe she'd forgotten something. Maybe she'd come back inside to grab her purse. Maybe she'd realized she wanted a drink of water before leaving again. None of those possibilities seemed unusual. A few seconds later, I heard another sound. The microwave door opened. Then it closed. It wasn't the sound of the microwave starting, just the unmistakable click of the door opening and then shutting again. Again, I paid almost no attention. It fit perfectly with what I already believed. Mom was still in the kitchen. She was probably heating something or grabbing a snack before leaving. There was nothing scary about it. I didn't even bother getting up to check. I kept staring at the computer screen. Another minute or two passed. The house became quiet again. Everything seemed completely ordinary. Then I heard the front door open. Voices, my mom laughing about something, my younger brother talking excitedly as they walked inside. I smiled to myself. Without even turning around, I called out toward the hallway. Wow, that was fast. You just left. There was a brief silence. Then my mom answered. What do you mean? I turned around in my chair. You just left to pick him up. She looked genuinely confused. No, she said. I've been gone for a while. I laughed because I thought she was joking. No, you weren't. You were just in the kitchen. She frowned. What are you talking about? I heard you using the sink. She stared at me. I wasn't here. You opened the microwave, too. She slowly shook her head. I left right after dropping you off. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. I remember feeling confused more than frightened. It simply didn't make sense. I knew what I'd heard. The sounds had been perfectly clear. The faucet, the microwave. The kitchen wasn't far from where the computer sat. I'd heard those exact noises thousands of times growing up. They weren't vague sounds that could easily be mistaken for something else. At least, that's how I remembered them. My mom insisted she hadn't come back into the house. She told me she'd driven straight to my brother's school after dropping me off. She hadn't forgotten anything. She hadn't turned around. She hadn't stopped back at the house. The timing also matched what she'd said. She had been gone long enough to pick up my brother and drive back home. If she had returned to the house in between, there wouldn't have been enough time. That realization made the conversation much stranger. I remember trying to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe one of the neighbors had been outside using a hose, and I somehow mistook the sound for our sink. Maybe the house had settled in a strange way. Maybe something had shifted inside the microwave. But none of those explanations really fit. The sounds had seemed so ordinary, so familiar. They sounded exactly like someone standing in our kitchen. Looking back, I think the strangest part wasn't the noises themselves. It was my reaction to them. I wasn't scared, not even slightly, because I believed someone I trusted was making those sounds. My brain never questioned them. I simply accepted that my mom was still home. There wasn't a single moment where I felt uneasy. No feeling that someone else might be inside the house. No instinct telling me to check the kitchen. No fear. Only after my mom walked through the front door with my brother did everything suddenly stop making sense. That delayed realization has always bothered me more than the noises. If someone had actually been inside the house, I had absolutely no idea. I had continued sitting with my back toward the hallway, completely distracted by the computer. I never checked. I never looked. I never even paused what I was doing. Of course, there was never any evidence that someone had been there. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been moved, at least not that we noticed. The doors were still locked. The windows were closed. The kitchen looked exactly the way it always did. There were no muddy footprints, no open cabinets, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. It was as though the sounds had never happened at all. Over the years, I've replayed that afternoon in my head more times than I can count. Memory isn't perfect. I know that. It's possible I misunderstood what I heard. It's possible two unrelated sounds blended together in my mind. It's possible I filled in details afterward because my mom insisted she hadn't been home. Human memory can be surprisingly unreliable. I understand all of that. But understanding it hasn't made the memory disappear. Whenever I think back to that afternoon, I can still hear the faucet turning on, the short rush of running water, the click as it turned off, then the microwave door opening, then closing. They sounded so normal, so ordinary, exactly the kinds of sounds that happen every day in a family home. Maybe that's why they've stayed with me all these years. If I'd heard footsteps upstairs or a loud crash in another room, I probably would have investigated immediately. Instead, I heard the most familiar household noises imaginable. Sounds so ordinary that they convinced me everything was perfectly fine. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd walked into the kitchen right then. Maybe I would have found absolutely nothing. Maybe I would have discovered some simple explanation that would have solved the mystery forever. Or maybe I would have found something I never wanted to see. I'll never know. I stayed exactly where I was until my mom and brother came home. Nothing else unusual happened that afternoon. Life carried on as normal. But every once in a while, when I'm home alone and I hear a faucet turn on in another room, or I hear the familiar click of a microwave door closing, I still pause for just a second before reminding myself to check who else is actually in the house. Because one ordinary afternoon when I was 13 taught me that sometimes the most unsettling experiences aren't the loud, dramatic ones. Sometimes they're just a few completely normal sounds coming from a room where no one should have been. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.